Lysander Santoro stood motionless before the crystal-clear window of Winterbell's most exclusive Christmas decoration boutique, his reflection ghosting over a 12-foot noble fir adorned with hand-blown Venetian glass ornaments. The store had closed 3 hours earlier, yet he remained planted on the snow-dusted sidewalk, expensive Italian leather shoes collecting powder he didn't bother to shake off. His wool coat hung open, despite temperatures hovering near freezing, as if cold were something that happened to other people. The window display represented perfection money could buy: cascading silver ribbons, porcelain angels with actual gold leaf wings, velvet stockings embroidered with crystals that caught streetlight and fractured it into rainbow shards. He studied this manufactured magic with the detachment of someone cataloging inventory rather than experiencing wonder. Behind him, the commercial district stretched empty and silent, storefronts dark except for security lights. Christmas Eve had driven everyone home hours ago, leaving the streets to him and the falling snow that muffled sound until the world felt wrapped in cotton. Lysander had dismissed his driver at 7, sent his security detail away at 8, choosing solitude over protection. The imported timepiece on his wrist read 11:47, which meant he'd been standing here for nearly 4 hours. Mom said it didn't come again this year. The voice arrived without warning, small and matter-of-fact, cutting through his isolation like scissors through silk. Lysander turned with the controlled precision of someone whose reflexes had been honed by necessity, finding a child approximately 6 years old standing 3 feet away. She wore a baby pink sweater that had seen better seasons, jeans that fit well enough to suggest careful shopping on limited budget, and sneakers with characters he didn't recognize. Her nose glowed pink from cold, huge eyes reflecting the window display with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing details rather than simply looking. Lysander's first instinct was to leave immediately because children represented complications his life couldn't accommodate. Yet something about her complete lack of fear kept him rooted. She wasn't looking at him with the wariness adults showed when they recognized predatory competence in another human. Instead, she studied him with focused curiosity. "Santa Claus," she clarified, apparently interpreting his silence as confusion rather than the paralysis it actually was. "Mom said he probably wouldn't come again because he's very busy and sometimes he forgets the apartments on Sterling Street." Her tone carried no bitterness, just practical acceptance of someone explaining obvious facts. The matter-of-fact delivery created cognitive dissonance in Lysander's carefully ordered mind because children weren't supposed to accept disappointment with such philosophical calm. He opened his mouth to ask where her mother was, then closed it because the question felt like accepting responsibility for a situation he'd never agreed to enter. "The tree in the window is my favorite," she continued, apparently unbothered by his lack of response. "I like how the ornaments aren't all the same color, how they put the gold ones next to the silver ones." She stepped closer to the glass, pressing small hands against the window. "At school, Miss Patterson said that's called composition." Lysander found himself looking at the display through her eyes, seeing intentional artistry where he'd only cataloged expensive components moments before. The arrangement did follow sophisticated design principles, each ornament placed to create visual flow that drew the eye in a specific pattern. He'd spent years learning to read patterns in business deals, yet somehow missed the deliberate beauty being sold. "I'm Bertie," she announced, turning back to face him with the kind of direct introduction adults had forgotten how to give. "My real name is Bridget Eleanor Rose, but that's too many names for one person, so everyone just calls me Bertie." She waited expectantly, clearly anticipating reciprocal introduction. "Lysander," he heard himself say, then immediately regretted the automatic response because names created connection, and connection created vulnerability. He should have lied, given her some generic alias that would evaporate from memory the moment this strange encounter ended. Instead, he'd handed over his actual identity to a 6-year-old with no concept of power structures. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he added, trying to reassert some form of adult authority over a situation that felt increasingly beyond his control. The words came out less commanding than he'd intended, more concerned than someone of his position should sound. Bertie smiled at him like he'd said something amusing rather than sensible. "I'm not alone. I'm with you," Bertie replied with the flawless logic of childhood, gesturing between them as if his presence constituted adequate supervision. "And besides, Mom's building is right there." She pointed across the street to a converted warehouse divided into apartments. Warm light glowed from several windows, including one on the 3rd floor, where a small decorated tree was visible. The explanation reconfigured the entire situation from child in danger to child being monitored, which should have relieved Lysander, but instead created new discomfort because it meant someone was watching this interaction. He glanced up at the lit window, imagining a mother tracking her daughter's movements while simultaneously preparing for night shift work that required leaving a 6-year-old alone on Christmas Eve. The angel on top is real porcelain, Bertie continued her narration, apparently content to have a silent audience for her observations. I looked it up on the library computer because I wanted to know what makes some decorations cost so much. She traced the angel's outline on the glass with one finger. Porcelain is special clay that gets fired in really hot ovens. Her casual mention of library research to understand luxury goods created a portrait of intelligence applied to circumstances that couldn't provide what that mind deserved. Lysander recognized the hunger for knowledge, remembered his own childhood questions about how things worked and why. The difference was that his questions had been answered by private tutors and temperature-controlled libraries, not public computers. "Do you have a tree?" Bertie asked, pivoting from her lecture on porcelain production to direct inquiry with the seamless transition children managed naturally. The question landed with unexpected weight, because the honest answer was no. His penthouse contained no seasonal decorations whatsoever. Christmas was something other people celebrated, families engaged with, not solitary men who deliberately excised sentiment from their existence. "I have a tree," Lysander found himself saying, the lie emerging before conscious decision could prevent it. "But it's not decorated yet." The fabrication continued building momentum, creating fictional scenarios his actual life had never contained. "I haven't decided on a color scheme." Bertie's eyes widened with an expression that suggested he'd just admitted to criminal negligence rather than simple procrastination. "You have to decorate before Christmas," she informed him with the absolute certainty of someone explaining universal laws to the uninformed. "Otherwise, it's just a tree inside a house," which doesn't make any sense. Her logic was unassailable, her tone patient despite dealing with someone clearly lacking basic knowledge. "Miss Patterson says the decorating is the important part, because that's when you put your personality on the tree." Lysander had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals with men who'd killed for less than what was at stake, yet found himself unable to counter a 6-year-old's reasoning about Christmas tree decoration protocols. The absurdity of the situation should have prompted him to end this interaction, walk away, return to his carefully controlled isolation. Instead, he heard himself asking what colors she would recommend, as if her opinion carried weight in decisions he'd never actually make. "Not all one color," Bertie said immediately, her response carrying the confidence of someone who'd given this considerable thought. "That's boring, and it makes the tree look like it's wearing a uniform instead of celebrating." She gestured toward the boutique window where the display tree showcased exactly the kind of mixed palette she was advocating. "You want it to look happy, not matchy." The distinction between happy and matchy represented a design philosophy Lysander had never encountered in his world of coordinated aesthetics and professional decorators who build by the hour. Everything in his life matched, from his custom suits to his penthouse furnishings, creating environments that projected power through careful curation. The idea that happiness might require intentional discord challenged assumptions he hadn't known he was making. "I could help you," Bertie offered, the suggestion emerging with the casualness of someone proposing they share an umbrella, rather than volunteering to enter a stranger's home. "I'm really good at decorating because I pay attention to composition and color theory." She said this without arrogance, simply stating facts about her capabilities. "Mom says I have an eye for making things beautiful, even when we don't have money for the fancy stuff." The offer created immediate complications, because accepting meant allowing this child, and presumably her mother, into his private space, crossing boundaries he'd maintained for 15 years. Lysander's penthouse was a fortress against connection, designed specifically to prevent the kind of intimacy that led to vulnerability. Yet something about her earnest offer, her genuine desire to help someone who clearly needed assistance with basic life skills like tree decoration, made refusal feel cruel rather than sensible. "Your mother would have to agree," he said, recognizing even as he spoke that he was negotiating terms rather than declining outright. "And it would need to be at a time that works with her schedule." The practicalities created distance from the emotional implications of what he was actually proposing, which was allowing strangers access to the carefully constructed emptiness he called home. "Mom works nights at Giovanni's," Bertie supplied, naming a restaurant Lysander knew by reputation as a place where service staff worked double shifts for tips that barely covered rent. "She does Tuesday through Saturday, 6 to 2 in the morning." The casual delivery of this information, revealed a child who understood her mother's schedule with precision born of necessity. So we could do it Sunday or Monday if you want. Lysander calculated the implications of this timeline, realized that Christmas would be over by Sunday, rendering the entire exercise pointless, except as an excuse to maintain contact with people he had no logical reason to see again. The rational part of his mind that had kept him alive in dangerous circumstances screamed warnings about emotional entanglement. The other part, the one he'd successfully suppressed for over a decade, whispered that maybe purposeless connection was exactly what his life lacked. Monday, he heard himself say, committing to a future interaction before he could reconsider. If your mother approves. He reached into his coat pocket, extracted one of the business cards he normally reserved for legitimate business contacts, and handed it to Bertie. The card listed his import company, a phone number that went to his personal line, nothing that revealed the full scope of his family's operations. Bertie accepted the card with both hands, studying it with the same focused attention she'd given the window display. Lysander Santoro, Import Acquisitions, she read aloud, sounding out the longer words with careful deliberation. That's a fancy title. She looked up at him with renewed interest. Do you import Christmas decorations? Is that why you know about the porcelain angels? The question demonstrated reasoning skills that would serve her well if life gave her opportunities to develop them, which seemed unlikely given her current circumstances. Lysander found himself wanting to answer honestly, to explain that his family's import business dealt primarily in luxury goods from Europe, including the very ornaments she'd been admiring. Instead, he simply nodded, allowing her to maintain whatever assumptions made him seem less dangerous than he actually was. I should go back now, Bertie announced, glancing toward her building where the third-floor window still glowed with warm light. Mom will be leaving for work soon, and she likes me to wave goodbye from the window. She carefully tucked his business card into her jeans pocket. I'll show her your card and tell her about helping with your tree. Before Lysander could formulate a response, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist in a brief hug that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but felt like it rearranged something fundamental in his chest. The gesture carried no agenda, no manipulation, just pure impulse from someone who'd decided he was worth hugging. Then she released him and started across the street, turning once to wave before disappearing into the building's entrance. Lysander stood frozen in the aftermath of that unexpected embrace, his expensive coat still holding the warmth where small arms had circled his torso. He couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him with affection rather than calculation, had initiated physical contact that sought nothing except brief connection. The sensation lingered like evidence of something he'd lost without noticing it was gone. The window on the 3rd floor drew his attention, and he watched as Bertie appeared there moments later, pressing her face against the glass and waving with both hands. Behind her, a figure moved into view, a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She placed a hand on Bertie's shoulder, then looked down toward the street where Lysander still stood. Even from this distance, he could read surprise in her posture. Lysander raised one hand in acknowledgement, a gesture that felt absurdly formal given the circumstances, but was all his muscle memory knew how to produce. The woman returned the wave with visible hesitation, then gently pulled Bertie back from the window. The small tree in their apartment seemed to glow brighter for a moment, or perhaps that was simply contrast against the surrounding darkness. Lysander remained on the sidewalk after Bertie disappeared from the window, his mind processing an interaction that had violated every protocol his life normally followed. He should leave now, call his driver, return to the penthouse and forget this entire strange encounter. Instead, he found himself studying the building across the street, noting details he'd never bothered to observe despite driving past this location countless times. The structure had been converted from its industrial origins with minimal investment. Windows added where loading doors had once stood. Fire escapes bolted to brick that showed decades of weather damage. Lights glowed from perhaps half the units, suggesting occupancy rates that reflected either affordable rent or low standards. This was the kind of building his family's real estate holdings would acquire and demolish, replacing with luxury condos that generated better returns. Movement at the building's entrance pulled his attention from architectural assessment, and he watched as the woman from the window emerged, now wearing a coat thrown hastily over what appeared to be a restaurant uniform. She moved with purpose across the street toward him, her body language broadcasting both determination and apprehension. This had to be Bertie's mother, coming to confront the stranger her daughter had been talking to for the past 20 minutes. Lysander braced himself for justified anger, prepared explanations that wouldn't sound predatory. calculated what his security team would say about this monumentally stupid situation he'd allowed to develop. The woman stopped 6 feet away, maintaining careful distance that demonstrated awareness of the risk strange men represented. Up close, she looked younger than he'd expected, probably not yet 30, with features that would have been striking if exhaustion hadn't settled into every line. "I'm Everly," she said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled tension that came from dealing with situations that required diplomacy despite triggering fear. "Birdie's mother." She didn't extend her hand, kept her arms crossed over her chest in unconscious protective posture. "She told me you were nice to her, that you talked about the window decorations." The statement hung between them, neither quite accusation nor acceptance. "She approached me," Lysander replied, recognizing that this distinction mattered even though it didn't actually absolve him of anything. "I didn't seek out interaction with your daughter." The formal phrasing made him sound like he was testifying rather than explaining. His default mode went under scrutiny. "She wanted to look at the Christmas display." Everly's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for him to categorize, finally settling on something that might have been resigned understanding rather than relief. "She does that," she said, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Talks to people like they're already friends. I've tried to teach her about stranger danger, but she thinks everyone is basically good until proven otherwise." The admission carried both pride and worry. "She gave you her business card," Everly continued, pulling the small rectangle from her pocket and studying it with an expression Lysander couldn't quite read. "Said you have a tree that needs decorating, and you might want help." She looked up at him directly for the first time. Green eyes searching his face for information his features had been trained not to reveal. Is that actually true? Or was she reading a situation wrong? The question gave him an exit, an easy way to dismiss the entire interaction as childish misunderstanding and walk away from whatever this was becoming. Lysander opened his mouth to take that exit, to politely disengage and return to his regularly scheduled isolation. Instead, he heard himself confirming the story. "I do have a tree, and she's right that it needs decorating." The lies were getting easier, building on themselves. "Mr. Santoro?" Everly began, his name sounding strange in her voice, like she was testing the weight of syllables she'd never expected to speak. "I appreciate that you were kind to Birdie, but I can't have her bothering strangers with offers to come decorate their homes." She delivered this with the gentle firmness of someone enforcing boundaries despite knowing it would disappoint her child. "Whatever she proposed, I need to decline on her behalf." "What if I was the one proposing it?" Lysander asked, surprising himself more than her with the question. He watched her eyes widen slightly, saw her recalculate what kind of situation she was actually navigating. "She clearly has talent for design," mentioned color theory and composition. "I could use that expertise." The justification sounded hollow even to him, but he continued anyway. Everly studied him with the kind of assessment people developed when they'd learned to recognize trouble before it arrived, when survival depended on reading situations accurately. Lysander stood still under that scrutiny, let her look for whatever signs would help her make this decision. He knew what she was seeing. Expensive clothes, controlled posture, the kind of polish that came from privilege. What she couldn't see was whether those markers predicted safety or threat. "I work nights," she said finally, the statement seeming to emerge from some internal calculation he couldn't follow. "Which means Birdie would be asleep during any time I could supervise a visit." And she paused, choosing next words carefully. "I can't bring my daughter to a stranger's home without me present. I'm sure you understand." The apologetic tone couldn't quite mask the absolute firmness of this boundary. "What if I hired you to bring her?" Lysander asked, the solution appearing fully formed, like his mind had been working on this problem without his conscious awareness. "As a consultant for interior design. Standard hourly rate, professional arrangement." He was making this up as he went, applying business frameworks to a situation that had nothing to do with commerce. The offer hung between them. While Everly processed implications, Lysander was only beginning to recognize himself. He was essentially proposing to pay this woman to spend time in his home with her daughter, which could be interpreted as either surprisingly ethical or deeply suspicious depending on perspective. Her face showed she was running both scenarios, weighing risk against whatever his money might provide. Why? The single word carried more weight than elaborate questions would have, demanded truth he wasn't entirely sure he could provide. Everly's eyes hadn't left his face, were reading micro-expressions his control usually prevented. "Why would you want a 6-year-old and her mother to come decorate a tree in your home? What's actually happening here?" Lysander didn't have an answer that made sense even to himself, Couldn't explain why a chance encounter outside a closed shop had penetrated defenses he'd spent 15 years reinforcing. The honest response was that Bertie's hug had reminded him he was still capable of feeling something besides the cold calculation that had become his default state. But saying that out loud would reveal vulnerability to someone who had every reason to view him as threat rather than opportunity. "I've been alone a long time," he said instead, offering partial truth because complete honesty felt too dangerous. "Sometimes that makes you forget what normal interaction looks like." He gestured toward the building she'd emerged from. "Your daughter reminded me of something I'd lost. I'd like to not lose it again quite so quickly." Everly's expression shifted through several calculations before settling on cautious consideration, her posture remaining guarded, but no longer quite as defensive. She pulled her coat tighter despite the gesture doing nothing against cold that came from uncertainty rather than temperature. "Professional arrangement," she repeated, testing the words like someone checking if ice would hold weight, "with clear boundaries and scheduled times. Monday afternoon," Lysander confirmed, recognizing negotiation when he heard it and knowing when to let the other party set terms. 2 hours, compensated at whatever rate you deem appropriate for design consultation. He kept his voice neutral, businesslike, stripping away any inflection that might suggest this was anything other than a standard transaction. "My penthouse is in the Ashford building on Merchant Street." The address landed with visible impact because everyone in the city knew the Ashford, knew that its residences started at prices most people couldn't earn in a decade. Everly's eyes widened fractionally before she controlled the reaction, but Lysander had already seen the recalibration happening behind her expression. He'd just revealed himself as someone operating in a financial stratosphere so far above hers that normal social rules might not apply. "I need to get to work," Everly said, glancing at the slim watch on her wrist that had seen better years. "Giovanni's doesn't accept lateness even on Christmas Eve." She pulled a pen from her coat pocket, wrote a phone number on the back of his business card, and handed it back to him. "Text me the address and apartment number. I'll let you know by Sunday if we're coming." The fact that she hadn't agreed outright demonstrated wisdom Lysander respected, showed she understood that sleeping on decisions prevented mistakes desperation might cause. She was protecting her daughter by building in time to research him, to verify that the Ashford address was real, to perhaps ask around about whether Lysander Santoro was someone safe to trust. He nodded acceptance of these terms without argument. "Bertie mentioned Santa Claus forgot Sterling Street again," Lysander said, the observation emerging before he'd consciously decided to speak. "Does that happen often?" The question ventured into territory their professional arrangement didn't cover, but something about the casual way Bertie had accepted disappointment bothered him more than he wanted to examine. Everly's face closed down immediately, pride replacing the cautious openness that had been developing. "We manage fine," she said, each word clipped and defensive. "Bertie understands that Christmas isn't about presents, that some years are harder than others." The statement dared him to pity them, to make this about charity rather than the business transaction she was willing to consider. "I wasn't suggesting otherwise," Lysander replied, recognizing he'd stumbled into sensitive territory that required careful navigation. "I was simply noting that she seems remarkably well-adjusted for someone dealing with disappointment." He paused, then added, "You've clearly done excellent work raising her." The compliment was genuine, which made it feel strange leaving his mouth. Something in Everly's expression softened slightly, the compliment landing in a way his money never could because it acknowledged her effort rather than her circumstances. "She's a good kid," Everly said, and for the first time, her voice carried warmth instead of just wariness. "Smart, curious, sees beauty in things most people walk past." She glanced back toward her building where the third-floor window still glowed. "I try to make sure the world doesn't damage that." The protective fierceness in that statement resonated with something Lysander recognized from his own family, though applied in completely different context. His grandfather had been similarly protective, though his methods involved eliminating threats rather than simply shielding loved ones from them. The impulse was the same even if the execution differed. "She's lucky to have you," he said, meaning it. Everly studied him for a long moment, and Lysander had the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen rather than simply observed. "Monday at 2, she finally said, making the decision in real time rather than waiting until Sunday. 2 hours, $200. She named a rate that was simultaneously too low for what she was actually risking, and probably more than she made in a full shift at Giovanni's. 300, Lysander countered, watching her eyes widen. For the expertise and the inconvenience of working on your day off. He said it like the additional 100 was about fair compensation, rather than the fact that 200 felt insulting, given what he spent on dinner without thinking. Plus, I'll arrange a car service for transportation since I assume you don't own a vehicle. The assumption was confirmed by the way her cheeks flushed slightly. Embarrassment at having her circumstances so accurately read, warring with relief that she wouldn't have to navigate public transportation. Fine, she agreed, the word emerging like she was accepting more than just money. But I reserve the right to leave immediately if anything feels inappropriate. The boundary was non-negotiable, her tone making that absolutely clear. Understood, Lysander said, respecting the line she was drawing even as he wondered what experiences had taught her to draw it so firmly. I'll text you the details tonight. He glanced toward Giovanni's, which was visible 3 blocks down where holiday lights still blazed despite the late hour. You should go. I've already made you later than you intended. Everly nodded, took 2 steps toward the restaurant, then turned back. Thank you, she said, and the gratitude carried layers he couldn't fully unpack. For being kind to Birdie, for not being what I was afraid you might be when I saw her talking to you. The admission cost her something to make, vulnerability she clearly didn't share easily. I have a sister, Lysander heard himself say, offering information he never shared with anyone outside his immediate circle. Had. She would have been about Birdie's age when she died. The words emerged without his permission, pulled out by something in Everly's expression. She used to talk to strangers too, saw the world the same way your daughter does. The revelation hung between them, explaining something about his reaction to Birdie that Lysander hadn't fully understood himself until speaking it aloud. Everly's face shifted through shock, sympathy, understanding, landing on a complicated expression that acknowledged shared loss without presuming to compare. I'm sorry, she said simply, the words carrying weight because she clearly meant them. Monday at 2, Lysander repeated, redirecting before emotion could complicate what needed to remain a simple transaction. I'll send the car at 1:30. He stepped back, creating physical distance that matched the emotional boundary he was reconstructing. Everly held his gaze for another moment, then turned and walked toward Giovanni's without looking back. Lysander watched until she disappeared into the restaurant, then finally pulled out his phone to call his driver. The screen showed 12 messages from his head of security, increasingly concerned about his location and extended absence. He ignored them all, instead opening a new text to the number Everly had written on his card. The message took longer to compose than any business communication he'd ever crafted. Each word weighed for implications and interpretations. Finally, he settled on simple facts: the Ashford's address, his apartment number, confirmation that a car would arrive at 1:30 Monday afternoon. He added one final line about looking forward to Birdie's design expertise, then deleted it as too personal, then added it back because the impersonal version felt wrong. Christmas morning arrived with silence so complete it felt unnatural, the city wrapped in collective pause that happened only once a year. Lysander stood at his penthouse window watching empty streets below, untouched coffee growing cold on the marble counter behind him. Sleep had been impossible after returning home, his mind replaying fragments of conversation with precision, usually reserved for contract negotiations. The 6-year-old's hug and the mother's cautious green eyes circled endlessly through his thoughts. The business card with Everly's phone number sat on his desk, where he'd placed it immediately upon entering the penthouse, the small rectangle carrying weight disproportionate to its physical presence. He'd picked it up 19 times since last night, opened his phone to compose texts he couldn't formulate, then set everything down without sending anything. The paralysis was foreign to someone whose professional existence consisted of decisive action executed without hesitation. Yet here he stood unable to manage a simple confirmation message about Monday's arrangement. The Douglas fir dominated his living room like an accusation, 12 feet of undecorated evergreen representing commitments made to strangers, based on nothing more substantial than momentary connection. Lysander approached the tree slowly, running his palm along branches that released sharp pine scent into air, usually perfumed by expensive candles. The tree was real in a way nothing else in his curated environment was, living proof he'd allowed spontaneity to override 15 years of careful control. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother, the annual Christmas greeting arriving with mechanical precision at 9 o'clock every December 25th. The message contained no warmth, just formal acknowledgement of the holiday, and reminder about family dinner scheduled for the following week. Lysander stared at the text, comparing its cold efficiency to Bertie's enthusiastic chatter about Christmas decorations and composition theory. The distance between those two worlds stretched impossibly wide. Marcus called twice before noon, ostensibly about year-end business, but actually checking on Lysander's uncharacteristic behavior the previous evening. The security chief's instincts were sharp enough to recognize when his employer's patterns shifted in ways suggesting either threat or opportunity. Lysander let both calls go to voicemail, unprepared to articulate what was happening when he barely understood it himself. Explaining that a child's innocent conversation had created fault lines in his carefully constructed isolation felt impossible. Across the city, Everly arrived home from Giovanni's at 3 a.m, her feet aching and her uniform smelling of grease and desperation that clung to late-night restaurant work. She checked on Bertie first, finding her daughter sprawled across their narrow bed with the abandoned comfort only children achieved in sleep. One arm hung off the mattress, clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit that had been her constant companion since age 2. The business card Lysander had given Bertie sat on their kitchen table where Everly had placed it after her daughter excitedly showed it to her. Expensive cardstock that felt wrong in their space of secondhand furniture and appliances that worked through determination rather than actual functionality. She picked it up, studying the raised lettering that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. Lysander Santoro, Import Acquisitions, the card proclaimed with understated elegance. She opened her laptop, the 7-year-old machine taking its customary 2 minutes to wake from sleep mode while she made tea in a mug with a chipped handle. The search bar felt simultaneously innocuous and dangerous, a portal to information that might confirm her worst fears about the well-dressed stranger her daughter had befriended. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, debating whether ignorance might be safer than knowledge. Then she typed his name with resigned determination that came from years of facing uncomfortable truths. The search results loaded with damning abundance, page after page of society photographs and business articles painting a picture of wealth operating in spheres so far above her reality, they might as well exist on different planets. Lysander Santoro at charity galas wearing tuxedos that cost more than her annual rent, standing beside people whose names she recognized from news coverage of political scandals. The photographs showed a man with controlled expression and careful distance from everyone around him. Nothing like the uncertain person who'd stood in the snow talking to Bertie. Further down the search results, articles grew more concerning. Mentions of his family's import business discussed with careful language suggesting legal complications nobody wanted to answer directly. References to his grandfather's generation building an empire through connections that predated modern oversight. Allusions to power structures operating outside conventional frameworks. Everly's stomach tightened as she read between carefully worded lines, understanding crystallizing that she'd agreed to bring her daughter to the home of someone whose family history involved exactly the kind of danger she'd spent years protecting Bertie from. She should cancel, send a polite text declining his offer, and return to their safe, predictable life of financial struggle and emotional isolation. The rational part of her brain that had kept them surviving through impossible circumstances screamed this obvious conclusion, listing all the ways this situation could go catastrophically wrong. Yet something stopped her from reaching for her phone. Some instinct insisting the man in these photographs wasn't quite the same person who'd admitted to being lonely. The vulnerability in his voice when he'd mentioned his sister had felt genuine, in a way staged photographs never could. Saturday morning brought Bertie's relentless questions about Monday's planned visit, her enthusiasm immune to the fact that her mother had slept only 3 hours. She wanted to know what kind of tree Lysander had, what colors they should recommend, whether his apartment was as fancy as the buildings she'd seen in movies. Everly answered with the patience born of 6 years of constant curiosity, even as her own anxiety about the arrangement grew with each innocent inquiry. Lysander spent Saturday in his home office, attempting to focus on year-end financial reports that required attention before the new year. The numbers blurred together, his usual ability to find patterns in data completely absent, while his mind wandered to the conversation he still needed to initiate. He'd drafted 17 different text messages to Everly, each version either too formal or too casual, too presumptuous or too distant. The difficulty of finding appropriate tone for someone who existed in the uncomfortable space between stranger and something more felt insurmountable. Finally, Sunday afternoon arrived with the weight of a deadline he could no longer avoid, forcing Lysander to compose the message he'd been paralyzed about for 2 days. He settled on simple facts: the Ashford's address, his apartment number, confirmation that car service would arrive at 1:30 Monday afternoon. The message felt inadequate given the magnitude of what he was asking, but anything more elaborate risked revealing the anxiety churning beneath his controlled exterior. He hit send before he could reconsider, then immediately wondered if he should have included something warmer. Everly's phone buzzed with the incoming text while she folded laundry, the notification making her heart rate spike in a way that felt disproportionate to a simple message. She made herself finish folding 3 shirts before checking, creating artificial delay that did nothing to calm nervous anticipation building in her chest. The address confirmed everything her research had revealed about the vast gap between their circumstances, the Ashford representing luxury she'd only seen in magazine spreads about how the wealthy lived. She stared at those details, feeling the full weight of what she was agreeing to by bringing Bertie into that world. The building where doormen wore uniforms and elevators required special keys to access penthouses would make their second-hand clothes and careful budgeting painfully visible. Yet Bertie's excitement about helping someone with his Christmas tree, her genuine belief that Lysander needed their assistance, made canceling feel like crushing something innocent and good. Everly typed a simple confirmation, adding that they would be ready at the specified time. The message felt inadequate, but anything more elaborate risked revealing how thoroughly the situation had disrupted her carefully maintained equilibrium. She hit send, then immediately second-guessed whether she should have established more explicit boundaries or expectations. The uncertainty was exhausting, this constant oscillation between hope that maybe this could be something positive and fear that she was making a catastrophic mistake. Bertie appeared in the doorway wearing her favorite baby pink sweater, already planning her outfit for Monday despite it being a full day away. "Mom, do you think Lysander has ever decorated a Christmas tree before?" she asked, the question emerging from wherever her active mind had been processing the situation. "Because if he hasn't, we'll need to teach him everything. Not just about colors, but about the feeling you're supposed to get when you look at it." Sunday morning arrived with the kind of brilliant winter sunshine that made snow-covered streets look like something from a postcard rather than the logistical nightmare they actually created. Lysander stood in his penthouse living room, staring at the bare 12-foot Douglas fir his staff had delivered and installed the previous afternoon. The tree occupied the corner where a modern sculpture usually stood, looking simultaneously majestic and accusatory in its undecorated state. He'd spent Saturday morning actually purchasing a tree, an activity he'd never personally undertaken in his adult life. The lot owner had been startled when Lysander arrived without assistants or decorators, even more surprised when he'd selected the tree himself, based on criteria he'd absorbed from Bertie's window commentary. The fir had good composition, branches distributed in a way that suggested intentional artistry, rather than random growth. The tree's presence transformed his carefully curated space in ways he hadn't anticipated, introducing organic irregularity into rooms designed for geometric precision. Every other object in the penthouse had been selected by professionals who understood his aesthetic preferences, arranged to project power through minimalist sophistication. The tree refused to coordinate with this vision, demanded attention through sheer living presence. Lysander's phone buzzed with Everly's response, arriving 36 hours after his initial text like she'd spent the entire weekend deciding whether to actually come. The message was brief, professional, confirming receipt of information and noting they would be ready at 1:30. No pleasantries, no questions, just acknowledgement of the arrangement. He found himself reading it multiple times anyway, analyzing tone that probably didn't exist in such sparse communication. His head of security, Marcus, appeared in the doorway with the kind of expression that suggested an intervention was imminent. The man had been with Lysander's family for 20 years, had watched him grow from angry teenager into controlled adult, and took certain liberties that came with that history. "You're having visitors tomorrow," Marcus said, statement rather than question, because obviously he'd already been briefed by building security. "A design consultant and her daughter," Lysander replied, keeping his tone neutral, even though he knew this explanation wouldn't satisfy. "They're helping with the tree." He gestured toward the fir like its presence explained everything, though it actually explained nothing about why he was personally involving himself in decoration. Marcus studied the tree, then Lysander, then back to the tree with an expression that suggested he was solving an equation that didn't balance correctly. "You've never decorated for Christmas," he observed, carefully not making it sound like an accusation. "In 15 years, you've never acknowledged the holiday existed beyond business obligations." He paused, then added, "Now you have a tree and strangers coming to your private residence. Things change," Lysander said, the response inadequate even to his own ears. He couldn't explain to Marcus what he didn't fully understand himself, couldn't articulate why a 6-year-old's hug had created fault lines and foundations he'd thought were permanent. I'm allowed to decide I want a decorated tree. The defensive edge in his voice revealed more than the words themselves. You're allowed to do whatever you want, Marcus agreed, his tone suggesting this freedom was precisely what concerned him. I'm just noting that sudden changes in pattern often indicate something worth examining. He moved further into the room, instincts honed by decades of threat assessment, making him scrutinize the tree like it might contain surveillance equipment. Who are these people, really? Lysander considered how much to reveal, weighed the benefits of transparency against the vulnerability it required. I met the child on Christmas Eve, he finally said, offering truth carefully edited for palatability. She was looking at Christmas displays. We talked. She offered to help decorate if I needed it. He deliberately left out the Sterling Street building, the absent Santa Claus, the mother working night shifts. So you decided to hire her and her mother to come to your home, Marcus summarized, each word precisely weighted to highlight the absurdity without directly criticizing. Despite knowing nothing about them beyond a conversation outside a store, he crossed his arms, settling into the stance that meant this discussion wouldn't end until he was satisfied. That's not like you. Maybe it should be, Lysander replied, surprising himself with the admission. Maybe spending 15 years avoiding any interaction that might lead to actual connection wasn't the triumph of discipline I thought it was. The words emerged with heat he hadn't known he was carrying, frustration with a life that had become successfully empty. Marcus's expression shifted from concern to something that might have been understanding, though he masked it quickly behind professional neutrality. I'm not criticizing your choices, he said, tone gentling slightly. I'm trying to understand what's changed so I can adjust security protocols appropriately. He paused, then added more quietly, and maybe make sure you're not setting yourself up for the kind of hurt you've worked very hard to avoid. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy, because Marcus had been there for the aftermath of the loss that had reshaped Lysander's entire approach to human connection. He'd watched a grieving 20-year-old systematically dismantle every relationship that required emotional vulnerability, building walls that turned into a prison so gradually no one noticed until it was too late to escape. I'm not setting myself up for anything, Lysander said, the lie obvious to both of them. Then what are you doing? Marcus asked, and the question carried genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Because from where I'm standing, you're making yourself vulnerable to people you have no reason to trust, which is either growth or self-destruction, and I can't tell which. Lysander walked to the window overlooking the city, finding the neighborhood where Sterling Street sat among blocks of converted warehouses and struggling businesses. Maybe both, he admitted, the honesty feeling like removing armor he'd worn so long he'd forgotten it was removable. Maybe I'm tired of being safe and alone. Maybe meeting that child reminded me I used to want things besides control. Marcus joined him at the window, following his gaze toward the older district visible in the distance. The mother, he said, understanding clicking into place with the intuition that came from knowing Lysander too well. You're interested in the mother. It wasn't quite a question, more an observation waiting for confirmation or denial. I don't know what I am, Lysander replied, which was more honest than any specific claim would have been. I know that talking to them felt different than any interaction I've had in years. I know that the child hugged me, and something that had been frozen started thawing. He turned to face Marcus directly. I know that sounds pathetic. It sounds human, Marcus corrected, his usually stern features softening into something almost paternal, which is not something I've been able to say about you for a long time. He sighed, coming to some internal decision. I'll run background on them. Nothing invasive, just making sure they are who they appear to be. And I'll adjust tomorrow's security to give you privacy while maintaining protocols. Lysander nodded acceptance, knowing this was Marcus's way of showing care through professional competence. Thank you, he said, meaning it for more than just the security arrangements, for not trying to talk me out of this, even though part of him wished someone would provide a logical reason to cancel Monday's arrangement, to retreat back into the safety of isolation. I stopped trying to protect you from yourself years ago, Marcus replied with dry humor. Now I just try to minimize collateral damage when you finally decide to feel something. He headed toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I hope this works out however you're hoping it works out. You deserve to have something in your life besides obligation and control. Monday afternoon transformed Lysander's normally ordered routine into a state of barely controlled chaos that started when he changed clothes 3 times before settling on casual slacks and a sweater that projected approachable wealth rather than intimidating power. The penthouse staff had been given the day off, leaving him alone with a decorated but empty space that suddenly felt too large and too silent. He'd arranged delivery of decoration boxes from 5 different luxury retailers, curating options without actually choosing anything definitive because that was supposedly what he was hiring Everly and Bertie to help with. The boxes sat stacked in the living room like evidence of either excessive preparation or inability to make simple decisions, containing everything from traditional glass ornaments to modern geometric shapes in metals and acrylics. Lysander had spent an irrational amount of time Sunday evening researching Christmas decoration trends, reading articles about color theory and composition, like he was preparing for a business negotiation rather than a simple afternoon with a woman and her daughter. 1:30 arrived with the precision of appointments that mattered, and building security called to announce his guests had been cleared through the lobby. Lysander's heart rate increased in a way it hadn't during actual dangerous situations, nervous system apparently unable to distinguish between legitimate threat and social uncertainty. He positioned himself near the door, then decided that looked too eager, and moved to the window, then realized that seemed dismissive, and settled on the kitchen where he could pretend to be casually occupied. The knock came soft but clear, and Lysander forced himself to wait 3 seconds before answering, so he wouldn't appear to have been hovering. He opened the door to find Everly and Bertie standing in his private hallway, both dressed more formally than necessary, like they were attending an interview rather than a decoration session. Everly wore a simple dress under her coat, her blonde hair styled rather than pulled back, and Lysander realized she'd put effort into her appearance that probably cost time she didn't have to spare. "Mr. Santoro," Everly greeted him with professional politeness that maintained careful distance despite the fact that they were about to spend 2 hours in close quarters. Her eyes were doing rapid assessment of visible portions of his penthouse, cataloging details that probably confirmed every assumption about wealth disparity. Bertie, in contrast, looked around with undisguised wonder, her entire face illuminated by curiosity rather than intimidation. "Lysander," he corrected, stepping back to allow them entry. "Mr. Santoro was my grandfather." The attempt at informality came out awkward, like he'd forgotten how casual interaction was supposed to sound. He closed the door behind them, hyper-aware of how the click of the lock might sound threatening rather than simply securing privacy. "Thank you for coming." Bertie immediately gravitated toward the tree like a moth to flame, her previous reserve vanishing in the face of 12 feet of undecorated potential. "It's perfect," she breathed, circling the fir with the focused attention of someone conducting professional evaluation. "The branch distribution is really good, and the height makes it impressive without being overwhelming for the space." She delivered this assessment with complete seriousness, her 6-year-old voice using terminology she'd clearly absorbed from educational sources. Everly watched her daughter with an expression mixing pride and something that might have been concern about Bertie's comfort in this environment. "She's been talking about this since Saturday," Everly said quietly to Lysander, her voice carrying an apology for enthusiasm. "I tried to manage her expectations, but she's convinced this tree is going to be a masterpiece." The unspoken addition was that Bertie didn't yet understand that masterpieces required more than good intentions. "I have supplies," Lysander replied, gesturing toward the stacked boxes that suddenly seemed excessive under Everly's evaluating gaze. "I wasn't sure what style to pursue, so I acquired options." The formal phrasing made him sound like he was describing a business acquisition rather than buying Christmas ornaments, and he watched Everly's lips quirk in what might have been amusement. "Options," she repeated, moving toward the boxes and kneeling to examine the contents. Her hands moved through the carefully packed ornaments with the kind of careful respect expensive things commanded from people who couldn't easily replace broken items. "These are from Winterbells," she observed, recognizing the boutique's distinctive packaging. "This is easily thousands of dollars worth of decorations." The observation hung in the air, highlighting the absurdity of his spending without quite criticizing it directly. Lysander found himself unable to explain that the expense had been irrelevant next to the goal of having appropriate supplies. That money was the one problem he could always solve while human connection remained perpetually out of reach. "I wanted to be prepared," he said instead, the explanation feeling inadequate. Bertie had joined her mother at the boxes, pulling out ornaments with gentle hands and arranging them on the floor in groups that apparently made sense according to principles Lysander couldn't yet discern. "We need to tell a story," she announced, looking up at both adults with the expectation that they would understand this pronouncement. "Miss Patterson says good design tells a story about who lives in the space, so we need to figure out what story your tree should tell." The question stopped Lysander cold, because he had no idea what story his life was supposed to tell. had spent 15 years actively avoiding any narrative arc that might lead to vulnerability or loss. His penthouse told the story of someone who valued control and aesthetic precision, who kept the world at arm's length through the careful curation of his environment. That wasn't a story that translated into Christmas decorations meant to celebrate warmth and connection. "What story do you think it should tell?" he asked Bertie, deflecting the question while genuinely curious about her perspective. She studied him with those enormous eyes that seemed to see past the careful presentation he showed the world, and Lysander felt uncomfortably exposed under that innocent scrutiny. "I think it should tell the story of someone who's been alone but doesn't want to be anymore," Bertie said with the casual devastation children achieved by simply stating obvious truths adults learned to hide. "So we should use warm colors and traditional shapes, things that feel like family and home." She said this while pulling out gold and deep red ornaments, already building her vision. Everly's face registered shock at her daughter's analysis, clearly wondering where Bertie had developed the insight to read Lysander so accurately after minimal interaction. "Bertie, that's perhaps too personal," she began, trying to walk back the observation without dismissing her daughter's intelligence. "We should ask Mr. Santoro what he wants rather than assuming." "She's right, though," Lysander interrupted, the admission emerging before he could reconsider the vulnerability it represented. "That's exactly the story." He knelt beside Bertie among the scattered ornaments, bringing himself to her eye level. "Show me how to tell it." The request was genuine, asking a 6-year-old to teach him something he'd forgotten or perhaps never learned. Bertie's face transformed into pure joy at having her vision validated, and she immediately began explaining her design philosophy with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who'd never learned to doubt her expertise. Everly watched this interaction with an expression Lysander couldn't fully decode, something between gratitude and concern, hope and fear. She lowered herself to the floor across from him, creating a triangle with Bertie at the apex, and for the first time in 15 years, Lysander felt like he was part of something that resembled family. The 2 hours stretched into 3 without anyone noticing the passage of time, conversation flowing naturally between explanations of ornament placement and discussions of color balance. Bertie orchestrated the decoration process with surprising authority, directing where each piece should go while explaining the reasoning behind her choices. Lysander found himself genuinely engaged in debates about whether gold or silver should dominate the upper branches, invested in decisions that would have seemed trivial 48 hours earlier. Everly's initial reserve gradually dissolved as she watched Lysander take direction from her daughter without condescension, treating Bertie's expertise as legitimate rather than humoring a child's play. She began offering her own suggestions, her eye for composition revealing itself through small adjustments that elevated the overall design. The 3 of them developed an unspoken rhythm, passing ornaments and working in coordinated silence punctuated by moments of collaborative decision-making. "Your sister," Everly said quietly during a moment when Bertie was focused on the tree's far side, the question emerging carefully, like she'd been building courage to ask. Would she have liked this? Her eyes held genuine curiosity, rather than prying intrusion, seeking to understand, rather than to satisfy nosiness. The question acknowledged the information Lysander had shared while respecting the pain beneath it. Lysander paused with a crystal snowflake suspended in his hand, considering how to answer a question he'd never allowed anyone to ask before. "She would have loved it," he finally said, the words carrying weight of 15 years of unexpressed grief. "Elena was obsessed with Christmas, used to start planning decorations in September." The memory arrived with unexpected clarity, bringing his sister's enthusiasm back to life for a moment. "She sounds wonderful," Everly replied, and the simple acknowledgement meant more than elaborate condolences would have, because it recognized Elena as a person, rather than just a tragedy. How old was she? The follow-up question demonstrated genuine interest, willingness to hear about his loss if he wanted to share it. 8, Lysander said, the number still capable of creating hollowness in his chest after all these years. A car accident that shouldn't have happened, caused by someone who'd been drinking at 2 p.m. He placed the snowflake on a branch with careful precision, focusing on the task to manage emotion threatening to surface. After that, my family became very focused on control, on eliminating variables that could lead to unexpected loss. The explanation sketched the outline of how an 8-year-old's death had transformed a family business into something harder, how grief had been channeled into power and protection rather than healing. Everly seemed to understand the subtext without requiring explicit details, her expression showing she could fill in gaps about how tragedy reshaped lives. Control doesn't actually prevent loss, she said quietly, speaking from her own experience. It just makes you feel less helpless while you're losing things anyway. Lysander looked at her directly, recognizing someone who'd faced her own versions of unexpected devastation and come through with different conclusions than his family had reached. "What did you lose?" he asked, the question more intimate than anything they'd discussed, but feeling like natural extension of the vulnerability they were trading. "Bertie's father," Everly answered, her voice steady despite the topic's obvious difficulty. "Not to death, but to the reality that some people aren't capable of the commitment they promise." She glanced toward her daughter, making sure Bertie remained absorbed in her decorating. "He left when she was 2, decided fatherhood was incompatible with the life he actually wanted." The matter-of-fact delivery couldn't quite mask the hurt underneath. "His loss," Lysander said, meaning it with an intensity that surprised him. "She's remarkable, which means you've done something extraordinary as a parent." The compliment emerged without calculation, pure observation about what he'd witnessed over the past few hours. Bertie's intelligence, kindness, and confidence were clearly products of intentional parenting, despite challenging circumstances. Everly's eyes brightened with unshed tears at the acknowledgement, suggesting she didn't receive recognition for her parenting efforts often enough. "Thank you," she said, voice slightly rough with emotion. "That means more than you probably realize." She cleared her throat, redirecting to safer territory. "She talks about you constantly, you know. Since Christmas Eve, it's been Lysander this and Lysander that." The revelation created warmth in Lysander's chest that had nothing to do with the penthouse's climate control, evidence that he'd made an impression on someone whose opinion he'd come to value. "She's easy to talk to," he replied, watching Bertie arrange a cluster of ornaments with focused intensity. "She doesn't approach conversation with the agenda most people carry. It's refreshing." "She doesn't know yet that people can be dangerous," Everly said, the statement carrying both pride and worry. "I'm trying to teach her caution without destroying her natural openness." The parenting dilemma was evident in her tone, the impossible balance between protection and freedom. "Someday someone will take advantage of her trust, and I won't be able to prevent it. But until then, she'll have experiences and connections people like me have deliberately avoided," Lysander countered, offering a perspective Everly might not have considered. "I've spent 15 years being cautious, and it's kept me safe, but also kept me from moments like this." He gestured around the room where a tree was becoming something beautiful through collaborative effort. "Maybe the risk is worth what it makes possible." Everly studied him with an expression that suggested she was recalibrating her understanding of who he actually was beneath the expensive clothes and powerful reputation. "You're not what I expected," she admitted, the confession clearly costing her something to make. "When Bertie first told me about you, I was terrified. Rich man talking to my daughter in an empty street felt like the beginning of every parent's nightmare." "You were right to be terrified," Lysander acknowledged, respecting her instincts rather than dismissing them. "Everything about that situation should have raised alarms." He met her eyes directly, letting her see his sincerity. "I'm glad you came anyway, that you were willing to take this risk despite every reasonable objection." "I almost didn't," Everly confessed, her fingers tracing the rim of a gold ornament without really seeing it. "I spent all of Sunday trying to talk myself out of coming, listing all the ways this could go wrong." She smiled slightly, self-deprecating. "Then Bertie asked if we were really going to help the lonely man with his tree, and I realized she'd seen something I was too scared to acknowledge." The description of himself as the lonely man landed with uncomfortable accuracy, stripping away the protective identity he'd constructed around isolation deliberately chosen, rather than suffered. "Is that what I am?" he asked, the question genuine rather than rhetorical. "Lonely?" The word felt strange in his mouth, too vulnerable and too accurate simultaneously. "I think you've been lonely for a very long time," Everly replied, her tone gentle despite the directness of the observation. "I think you've built an entire life around not being lonely, but that's different from actually having company." She paused, then added, "I recognize it because I've been doing the same thing, just with fewer resources and different methods." The parallel she was drawing created connection Lysander hadn't anticipated, suggesting their circumstances were less different than surface details implied. "So, what do we do about it?" he asked, the question encompassing more than just immediate decoration plans. He was asking about the tentative something developing between them, the possibility neither had named, but both felt. "We finish this tree," Everly said, bringing conversation back to concrete tasks, even as her eyes suggested she understood the larger question. "We let Bertie create her masterpiece, and then maybe we figure out if there's a reason to do this again." The careful phrasing left space for retreat while opening door to future interaction. "I'd like that," Lysander replied, committing to continuation without defining what that continuation would entail. "There's a tree lighting ceremony in Bryant Park on Wednesday. I have access to the VIP section." The invitation emerged more awkwardly than any business proposal he'd ever made, rusty social skills struggling with personal interaction. Everly's smile transformed her face, erasing years of exhaustion and worry for a moment. "Birdie would love that," she said, acceptance implicit in the statement. "I'm off Wednesday nights." The practical confirmation felt like something momentous, despite its casual delivery, an agreement to deliberately choose each other's company again. Wednesday evening arrived wrapped in the kind of perfect winter conditions that made Christmas cards seem documentary rather than aspirational. Snow falling in gentle flakes that caught light from a million decorative bulbs strung through Bryant Park. Lysander had arranged premium access to the VIP viewing platform, a heated enclosure with clear walls offering unobstructed views of the ceremony while protecting against the cold. He arrived early, unusual for someone who typically calculated entries to avoid unnecessary waiting. Birdie spotted him first when she and Everly emerged from the car service he'd sent, her enthusiastic wave drawing amused attention from other attendees who weren't accustomed to such unguarded displays in the carefully curated VIP space. She wore a red coat that looked new, and Lysander felt obscurely pleased that Everly had used some of Monday's payment for her daughter, rather than just practical necessities. The thought that he'd contributed to something that made Birdie happy created satisfaction disproportionate to the actual gesture. "The tree is perfect," Birdie announced as greeting, referring to the massive Norway spruce dominating the park rather than any conventional hello. "It's at least 40 feet tall, maybe more." She pressed her face against the clear wall, breath creating fog patches that she wiped away impatiently. "Do you think they use a crane to put the star on top, or do people actually climb up there?" Everly followed more slowly, her expression showing she was processing the VIP accommodation with visible discomfort about the expense and access it represented. She'd dressed carefully again, wearing a coat that had seen multiple seasons but was clean and well-maintained, her hair loose around her shoulders in a style that suggested she'd put effort into her appearance. Lysander felt his pulse accelerate in a way that had nothing to do with external threat. "There's hot chocolate," he said, gesturing toward the refreshment station where premium beverages were being served in actual ceramic mugs rather than disposable cups. "And some food if you haven't eaten." The offer came out stilted, his usual confidence deserting him in social situations that required warmth rather than controlled authority. He watched Everly's face for reaction, trying to read whether he was managing this correctly. "This is too much," Everly said quietly, her words meant only for him, while Birdie remained absorbed in tree observation. "The car service, the VIP access, all of it. I can't let you keep spending money on us like we're charity cases." The protest carried dignity rather than anger, establishing boundaries around what she was willing to accept. Her eyes held his, demanding honest response rather than polite deflection. "You're not charity," Lysander replied, keeping his voice equally low. "I'm not doing this because I pity your circumstances. I'm doing this because spending time with you and Birdie is the first thing that's felt right in 15 years. The confession emerged with more rawness than he'd intended, vulnerability he usually guarded showing through cracks in his composure. "If that makes you uncomfortable, I'll stop, but don't assume this is about economics." Everly's expression cycled through several emotions before settling on something that might have been cautious hope, mixed with remaining skepticism. "Then what is it about?" she asked, the question cutting to the core of what was developing between them. "Because I need to understand what's happening here before I let Birdie get more attached." The mother's protective instinct surfaced, prioritizing her daughter's emotional safety over her own growing feelings. "Honestly," Lysander ran a hand through his hair, disrupting the careful styling that usually remained perfect through entire days. "I don't entirely know. I know that meeting Birdie reminded me I used to be capable of feeling things besides calculated control. I know that talking to you feels different than any interaction I've had in years." He paused, searching for words adequate to explain something he barely understood himself. "I know I want to keep doing this, whatever this is." The lighting ceremony began before Everly could respond, music swelling as the massive tree's illumination sequence started from bottom to top. Birdie's delighted gasp drew both adults' attention, her face transformed by wonder as thousands of lights blazed to life in coordinated patterns. Lysander found himself watching Birdie's reaction more than the actual display, her joy more captivating than any technological achievement. Everly's hand found his during the climactic moment when the tree reached full illumination, her fingers threading through his with deliberate intention, rather than accidental contact. Lysander looked down at their joined hands, then up to her face, where he found an expression that mixed determination with nervousness. "I want to keep doing this too," she said, her words barely audible over the crowd's applause. "But I need you to understand that comes with Birdie. We're a package deal." "I know," Lysander replied, tightening his grip on her hand. "I wouldn't want it any other way." The truth of that statement surprised him even as he spoke it, realizing that Birdie's presence was integral rather than incidental to what he valued about these interactions. The child had been the catalyst, but both of them had become essential to whatever transformation he was experiencing. The crowd began dispersing after the ceremony concluded, but their small group remained in the VIP enclosure, Birdie content to watch the lit tree, while the adults negotiated the parameters of their developing relationship. "My family won't understand this," Lysander said, introducing complexity he couldn't ignore despite wishing he could. "They'll see you as a distraction or worse, a threat to the focus they've spent years cultivating in me." "What will they see Birdie as?" Everly asked, the question sharp because she understood that perception would determine whether this could actually continue. Her protective instincts were fully engaged now, evaluating whether exposing her daughter to his world would ultimately cause more harm than the benefits justified. Will they see her as a charming child, or as a weakness to exploit? The question forced Lysander to confront realities about his family he'd been avoiding since Christmas Eve, to acknowledge that the power structure he'd inherited came with perspectives and methods that wouldn't accommodate what he was attempting to build. "I don't know," he admitted, the uncertainty more frightening than definitive threat would have been. "My family's primary concern is maintaining control and eliminating vulnerability. They might see both of you as either." Everly pulled her hand away, the withdrawal physical manifestation of emotional retreat, as she processed the implications of what he was describing. "Then we have a problem," she said, her voice carrying the flatness of someone making difficult calculations. "Because I won't expose Birdie to people who might view her as a target or a tool." She crossed her arms, body language closing off despite the connection that had been developing moments earlier. "I'm working on transitioning away from family obligations," Lysander said, the plan forming even as he spoke it, because losing what was developing with Everly and Birdie felt intolerable in a way continued isolation didn't. "The import business has legitimate operations that don't require the connections my grandfather built. I can separate what I do from what they do." The proposal was more complicated than he was making it sound, would require navigating family politics he'd previously accepted as permanent constraints. "That's a massive life change to consider, based on 3 interactions with people you barely know," Everly observed, her tone suggesting she wasn't sure whether to be flattered or concerned by the scope of what he was proposing. "You're talking about restructuring your entire existence for the possibility of something that might not even work out." She wasn't wrong to question the rationality of his developing plan. "I'm talking about restructuring my existence because the current version isn't working," Lysander corrected, realizing the truth of it as he articulated the thought. "Meeting you and Birdie showed me that, but it's not about you fixing something broken in me. It's about me choosing to fix it myself." He moved closer, not touching, but eliminating the distance that had opened between them. "You're the catalyst, not the solution." Everly searched his face for something, her expression gradually softening from defensive protection toward cautious receptivity. "Okay," she said finally, the single word carrying weight of significant decision. "But this has to move slowly. I need to see evidence that you're serious about changing your life before I involve Birdie more deeply." The boundary was reasonable, protecting her daughter while leaving space for possibility. "Fair," Lysander agreed, accepting terms that were actually more generous than he deserved given the risk she was taking. "What would evidence look like to you?" The question sought concrete parameters, specific goals he could work toward rather than vague promises about eventual transformation. "Distance from whatever dangerous elements exist in your family business," Everly said immediately, clearly having thought about this already. "Transparent communication about your progress, and time to build trust gradually, instead of rushing into something neither of us fully understands." She glanced toward Birdie, who remained mesmerized by the illuminated tree. "An absolute protection of Birdie from any fallout from your family relationships." "I can do that," Lysander said, committing to requirements that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life. "I will do that." The vow felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating, acknowledging that what he stood to gain outweighed the certainty he'd be sacrificing. Everly's slight smile suggested she recognized the magnitude of what he was promising. Bertie turned from the tree finally, her face glowing with happiness that had nothing to do with reflected lights. "This is the best night ever," she announced, moving to stand between the two adults and taking each of their hands. "Can we come see the tree again before Christmas is over?" The request was directed at both of them equally, assuming a unit rather than separate individuals. Lysander looked at Everly over Bertie's head, seeking permission before committing to future plans. Everly held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "We can do that," he told Bertie, then added to Everly, "if that works with your schedule." The deference to her authority as Bertie's mother was deliberate, acknowledging that his resources didn't override her parental decisions. January arrived with the kind of bitter cold that turned the city into a test of endurance, wind cutting through even the most expensive coats with democratic cruelty. Lysander stood outside the converted warehouse on Sterling Street for the third time in as many minutes, his driver waiting in the Mercedes half a block away per his instructions. The building looked worse in daylight than it had on Christmas Eve, structural compromises visible in cracked masonry, and windows sealed with plastic against drafts that management refused to address. Everly had invited him for dinner after he'd mentioned wanting to see where they lived, her offer carrying both pride and visible anxiety about exposing their circumstances to his scrutiny. He'd accepted immediately, recognizing the invitation as a test of whether he could handle the reality of her world without judgment, or the kind of performative sympathy that would insult them both. The buzzer system was broken, so he texted his arrival and waited, watching his breath form clouds in air that smelled of exhaust, and dreams deferred. Bertie appeared in the building's entrance wearing her baby pink sweater and an expression of pure excitement, apparently having been watching for him from their third-floor window. She grabbed his hand without hesitation, pulling him toward stairs that creaked ominously under their combined weight. "We made spaghetti," she announced, her enthusiasm undimmed by the peeling paint and flickering hallway lights. "Mom says it's nothing fancy, but I helped with the sauce, so it's going to be really good." The apartment was smaller than Lysander's master bathroom, a fact he processed without allowing any reaction to show on his face, because Everly was watching him with the kind of defensive vigilance that came from years of being judged for circumstances beyond her control. The space was immaculately clean despite its age, furniture arranged to maximize the limited square footage, personal touches revealing Everly's eye for creating warmth from minimal resources. Bertie's artwork covered one wall in a gallery that showcased her developing artistic sensibility, each piece carefully mounted with the kind of care expensive frames would have received. "It's not much," Everly said, the statement attempting to preempt criticism while simultaneously daring him to voice any. She stood near the tiny kitchen, arms crossed in unconscious protective posture. "But it's ours, and it's safe, and Bertie has everything she actually needs." The emphasis on actually carried weight, distinguishing between genuine necessity and the luxuries his world took for granted. "It's a home," Lysander replied, choosing his words with the precision this moment demanded, "which is more than I can say about my penthouse." He moved toward the wall of Bertie's artwork, studying each piece with genuine attention. "These are remarkable. She has real talent, not just childish enthusiasm but actual compositional understanding." The observation was professional, rather than patronizing, recognizing ability that deserved acknowledgement. Dinner was chaotic in ways Lysander's carefully controlled existence never allowed, Bertie maintaining constant commentary about her day at school, while Everly orchestrated the small kitchen with practiced efficiency. The spaghetti was simple, but well executed, the sauce revealing Bertie's contribution through slightly uneven seasoning that somehow made it more genuine than perfect would have been. They ate at a table that required careful positioning to accommodate 3 chairs, knees occasionally bumping in the cramped space. "Miss Patterson wants to meet you," Bertie announced between bites, apparently having been waiting for the right moment to deploy this information. "I told her about how you're teaching me about business and imports, and she said any adult who takes time to educate children about career possibilities should be acknowledged." She delivered this with the precise diction of someone quoting her teacher verbatim, clearly proud of remembering the exact phrasing. Everly's fork paused halfway to her mouth, surprise evident that her daughter had been discussing Lysander at school without her knowledge. "Bertie, we talked about keeping some things private," she began, though her tone suggested this was a familiar battle she was losing. "Mr. Santoro might not want to meet your teacher." The escape route she was offering him was clear, an easy way to decline without disappointing Bertie directly. "I'd be honored to meet Miss Patterson," Lysander said, watching Everly's eyebrows rise at his ready acceptance. If it fits with school policies and your comfort level. He addressed this last part to Everly, acknowledging her authority over Birdie's life even as he volunteered for deeper involvement. The truth was that meeting Birdie's teacher felt like exactly the kind of normal parental activity his life had been missing, even though he had no official role that justified the designation. The visit to Birdie's school happened the following Tuesday, Lysander arriving in clothes carefully selected to appear successful, but not ostentatious, aware that elementary school parking lots weren't accustomed to Mercedes sedans and custom Italian suits. Miss Patterson was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, with the kind of practical warmth that suggested genuine calling rather than career default. She shook his hand with firm grip, and assessing eyes that immediately began cataloging what kind of influence he might represent in Birdie's life. "Birdie speaks very highly of you," Miss Patterson said, the statement carrying layers of meaning about how thoroughly his presence had integrated into her students' daily narrative. "She's been much happier this past month, more confident in class discussions, more willing to share her ideas." The observation was delivered as compliment and question simultaneously, seeking to understand what had changed in Birdie's home life to produce this positive shift. Lysander found himself explaining the tree decorating and subsequent visits without quite defining the relationship he was building with Everly and Birdie, the boundaries still too uncertain to claim titles that might not be accurate. Miss Patterson listened with the kind of careful attention educators developed for reading between lines of what parents didn't say. "Whatever you're doing, it's working," she concluded, her smile genuine. Birdie needed a positive male influence, someone who validates her intelligence and creativity. The conversation with his uncle happened that same week, a confrontation Lysander had been avoiding, but could no longer postpone, as his systematic withdrawal from family operations became impossible to ignore. They met in his uncle's office, a space designed to intimidate through dark wood and photographs of 3 generations of Santoro men who'd built power through methods that didn't bear close examination. His uncle sat behind an enormous desk, fingers steepled in the classic pose of someone preparing to deliver judgment. "You're making changes," his uncle said, the statement requiring no confirmation, because obviously he'd been monitoring Lysander's activities, severing connections that took your grandfather 40 years to establish, walking away from arrangements that have sustained this family's position. The accusation was clear, even though technically these were just observations, his tone communicating that this behavior constituted betrayal of blood obligations. "I'm focusing on the legitimate aspects of our import business," Lysander replied, keeping his voice level, despite the anger building in his chest. "The parts that don't require relationships with people whose methods I can't defend." He met his uncle's eyes directly, refusing to look away first. "I'm building something I can be proud of rather than something I have to justify through family loyalty." His uncle's expression hardened into the kind of cold calculation that had always made younger Lysander reconsider his positions. But 15 years and one 6-year-old's unconditional acceptance had changed the power dynamics fundamentally. "This is about the woman and her daughter," his uncle said, turning the statement into an accusation. "You're restructuring your entire life for people you've known for a month, compromising family interests for sentiment." The word sentiment was delivered like a diagnosis of weakness requiring intervention. "I'm restructuring my life because the current version wasn't sustainable," Lysander corrected, hearing echoes of what he'd told Everly at Bryant Park. "They showed me that, but this isn't about them fixing something broken in me." He stood, recognizing this conversation had reached its inevitable conclusion. "This is about me choosing what kind of man I want to be, independent of what the family requires." The kiss happened on a Friday evening in late January, snow falling outside Everly's apartment window, while Birdie slept in the next room after a long day at school. They'd been sitting on her worn couch discussing Lysander's confrontation with his uncle, Everly listening with the kind of focused attention that made him feel truly heard for the first time in years. The conversation had drifted into comfortable silence, and when he looked at her, he found she was already looking at him with an expression that mixed hope and hesitation, and something that might have been invitation. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to retreat, if this wasn't what she wanted, but she met him halfway, with the kind of deliberate choice that made the moment feel momentous, rather than impulsive. The kiss was gentle and brief, neither of them ready for passion, but both acknowledging that something fundamental had shifted between them. When they pulled apart, Everly's eyes were bright with unshed tears that she blinked away quickly, her smile transforming her entire face into something radiant. 3 months transformed the tentative connection forged at Bryant Park into something with deeper roots, though the path hadn't been smooth or certain. Lysander had spent January and February systematically disentangling himself from the more questionable aspects of his family's operations, a process that created friction with relatives who viewed his retreat as betrayal rather than evolution. Marcus had been invaluable during the transition, helping identify which business relationships could be maintained and which required complete severance. The legitimate import business proved more than sustainable, once separated from obligations that had always made Lysander uncomfortable, suggesting his family's power had been more about control and reputation than actual economic necessity. He'd established new supplier relationships based on transparent contracts, rather than inherited connections that came with unspoken expectations. The work was satisfying in ways his previous role had never been, built on merit rather than fear. Everly and Bertie had become constants in his life, through carefully measured steps that respected the boundaries Everly had established. Tuesday evenings became designated time together, initially just dinners at family-friendly restaurants where Bertie could be herself, without the formality his usual haunts required. Those dinners evolved into cooking together at his penthouse, Bertie teaching him her favorite recipes, while Everly supervised with amused commentary about his complete lack of basic kitchen skills. The transformation extended beyond his business dealings into his entire approach to life, as if Bertie's presence had given him permission to rediscover parts of himself he'd buried with Elena 15 years earlier. He found himself laughing at ridiculous jokes, engaging in completely impractical activities like building blanket forts, and experiencing emotions he'd convinced himself were weaknesses, rather than essential components of being fully human. Everly watched this evolution with expressions that cycled between hope and caution. His family's reaction had been predictably negative, ranging from his mother's cold disapproval to his uncle's more direct accusations about compromising family interests for sentimental attachments. Lysander had weathered these confrontations with Marcus's support, establishing firm boundaries about what aspects of his life remained family business and what had become exclusively his own concern. The process had been painful, but necessary, severing connections that had become chains rather than bonds. March arrived with unexpected warmth that melted the last remnants of winter snow, creating conditions perfect for the outdoor activities Bertie had been eagerly anticipating since February. Lysander had arranged a private afternoon at a botanical garden, knowing that Bertie's love of composition and color would find endless satisfaction among spring flowers just beginning to bloom. The three of them wandered through carefully maintained paths, Bertie providing running commentary about plant species she recognized from school lessons. "Mom says you're going to ask her something important today," Bertie announced with the casual devastation of children who hadn't learned that some knowledge was supposed to remain private. She skipped ahead on the path, apparently unaware that she'd just destroyed whatever element of surprise Lysander had been planning. Everly's face flushed deep red, her expression mortified that her daughter had revealed conversations meant to remain between mother and child. Lysander laughed, the sound genuine rather than polite, amused by the impossible task of maintaining adult dignity around someone as refreshingly direct as Bertie. "Did she tell you what I was going to ask?" he inquired, curious about how much Everly had actually shared versus how much Bertie had inferred from overheard fragments. "She said you might ask if we want to be a real family instead of just friends who see each other on Tuesdays," Bertie replied, turning to walk backwards so she could watch both adults' faces. "I told her that was a silly question because obviously we should be a real family." Her certainty on the matter was absolute, as if the outcome was so obvious that formal questions were merely procedural. Everly covered her face with both hands, clearly wishing she could disappear rather than face this conversation that was supposed to have unfolded, with significantly more romance and considerably less 6-year-old commentary. "I did not phrase it exactly like that," she said through her fingers, her voice muffled by embarrassment. "And I told you that conversation was private, Bertie." "But it's a good thing," Bertie protested, confused about why privacy mattered when the subject was clearly positive. "Why wouldn't we tell Lysander that we want him to be my dad officially?" She said this with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating obvious truths, apparently seeing no reason for adult complications around straightforward desires. The word dad hit Lysander with unexpected force, a title he'd never imagined applying to himself, and certainly hadn't anticipated Bertie claiming for him. He looked at Everly, who was peeking through her fingers with an expression mixing mortification with tentative hope, clearly wondering how he was processing this accelerated revelation of their private discussions. "Is that what you want?" he asked Everly, needing to hear it from her directly. Everly lowered her hands, taking a deep breath before meeting his eyes. "Yes," she said simply, abandoning whatever careful speech she'd probably prepared. "I want us to be a family. I want Birdie to have the father figure she deserves, and I want whatever is developing between us to have room to grow into something permanent." The admission came without the protective barriers she usually maintained, raw honesty that left her completely exposed. Lysander had purchased a ring 3 weeks earlier, a simple but beautiful piece that represented commitment, without the ostentatious display his family would have expected. He'd carried it with him for days, waiting for the perfect moment that Birdie had just thoroughly demolished with her characteristically direct approach. He pulled the small box from his pocket, watching Everly's eyes widen with surprise, despite her daughter's spoiled revelation. "I was going to make a speech," he said, opening the box to reveal the ring. "Something about how you've both transformed my understanding of what life could be, how Birdie reminded me I was still capable of joy, how falling in love with you has been the most terrifying and necessary thing I've ever done." He smiled at Birdie, who was watching with barely contained excitement. "But apparently we're skipping the formal parts." "You love my mom?" Birdie asked, the question carrying weight despite her young age, because she understood that word represented something significant. Like, actually love her, not just like her? She stepped closer, her expression serious in a way that suggested this answer mattered more than anything else. "Actually love her," Lysander confirmed, saying it out loud for the first time despite having known it for weeks. "And I love you too, if that's okay." The addition felt necessary because his feelings for Birdie were different from but equally important as what he felt for Everly. "I know I'm not your biological father, but I'd like to be your dad if you'll let me." Birdie launched herself at him with the full-body hug that had become her signature greeting, wrapping arms and legs around him in a koala-like embrace that nearly knocked him backwards. "Obviously, yes," she said into his shoulder, her voice muffled by his coat. "I've been calling you my dad to my friends at school for like a month already." This revelation was delivered as casually as all her other bombshells, as if everyone already knew information she'd just disclosed. Lysander looked at Everly over Birdie's shoulder, one arm wrapped around the child, while his other hand still held the ring box. Everly was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter claim the father she'd been missing. "Is that a yes?" he asked, needing explicit confirmation, despite the answer being obvious from her expression. Everly crossed the small distance between them, creating a 3-person unit as she wrapped her arms around both Lysander and Birdie. "Yes," she said against his neck, her breath warm on his skin. "To all of it. To being a family, to whatever comes next, to building something real together." She pulled back enough to look at him directly. "I love you too. I probably have since you let a 6-year-old lecture you about Christmas tree composition." Lysander managed to extract the ring from its box despite Birdie's continued grip, sliding it onto Everly's finger with the kind of coordination that really shouldn't have been possible given the circumstances. The ring fit perfectly, catching afternoon light and throwing small rainbows across all 3 of them. Birdie finally released her hold enough to grab both their hands, studying the ring with the focused attention she gave everything that interested her. "When do we tell people?" Birdie asked, already planning announcements before the adults had fully processed what they'd just committed to. "Can I tell Miss Patterson tomorrow? She's been asking why I'm so happy lately." The question assumed a timeline none of them had actually discussed, but somehow that felt appropriate given how their entire relationship had developed through organic evolution, rather than careful planning. "You can tell whoever you want," Everly said, her voice still rough from crying but filled with joy that transformed her entire presence. "This is real. This is happening, and we don't have to hide it or qualify it." She looked at Lysander, seeking confirmation that he agreed with this approach. "Unless you need time to manage your family's reactions first, they'll react however they react," Lysander replied, finding he didn't care about his family's approval the way he once would have. "You and Birdie are my family now. Everything else is secondary." The declaration felt like the final severance of obligations that had defined him for 15 years, choosing the people who'd seen his potential for transformation over those who'd benefited from his controlled isolation. The 3 of them stayed wrapped together for a long moment, forming a unit that felt both brand new and somehow inevitable, as if this had been the destination all along, despite none of them seeing it coming. A year ago, Lysander had been standing alone outside Winterbell's boutique, studying Christmas decorations with the detachment of someone cataloging expensive inventory. Now he was engaged to a woman he'd met through chance encounter, preparing to become father to a remarkable child who'd seen through his defenses to the lonely person underneath. "We should celebrate," Bertie announced, apparently deciding that sufficient time had been spent on emotional moments and action was now required. Like, with cake or something equally good. She tugged on both adults' hands, trying to pull them toward the garden exit. "Miss Patterson says all important moments deserve cake." Everly laughed, the sound bright and unguarded in a way Lysander had learned meant she was genuinely happy rather than performing happiness for social requirements. "Miss Patterson is clearly a wise woman," she agreed, allowing Bertie to lead them along the path. "What kind of cake should we get for becoming a family?" She posed the question to Bertie, but looked at Lysander, including him in the decision because that's what families did. "Chocolate," Bertie said immediately, her preference apparently long established. "With vanilla frosting because chocolate frosting is too much chocolate all at once." She delivered this opinion with the authority of someone who'd given dessert philosophy considerable thought. "And we should get it from Bellamy's because they make the best cakes in the whole city." Lysander had no idea where Bellamy's was, or whether their cakes justified Bertie's absolute confidence, but he found himself genuinely looking forward to finding out. 6 months ago, the specific bakery wouldn't have mattered because celebration itself would have felt foreign and uncomfortable. Now he was planning cake acquisition with the same seriousness he'd once applied to business negotiations, because making Bertie happy had become as important as any deal he'd ever closed. They walked toward the garden exit as a unit, Bertie between her mother and soon-to-be father, already chattering about whether they should also get ice cream, because cake alone might not be sufficient celebration for such an important day. Lysander caught Everly's eye over their daughter's head, found her smiling at him with an expression that mixed love and amusement and deep satisfaction. This was his life now, and it was so completely different from anything he'd imagined that he could barely recognize the person he'd been before Christmas Eve. The Botanical Gardens exit opened onto a street busy with afternoon traffic and people going about ordinary lives, but Lysander barely noticed the surrounding activity because his entire focus was on the two people whose hands he was holding. Family had always meant obligation and control, legacy and expectations that shaped every choice. Now it meant a woman who challenged him to be better, and a child who reminded him that joy was possible even after years of deliberate emotional shutdown. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing you stories that touch the heart. Let me know which moment resonated with you most. Was it the first meeting outside Winterbells? The tree decorating afternoon? Or perhaps the proposal in the garden? I love hearing your thoughts.
Все равно, сути дела не меняет, как бы зарплата плюс-минус везде там, больше, чуть меньше. Как бы, и, наверное, это все, вот эта общая ситуация, наверное, у многих привела, во-первых, сфера развлечений, да, всякие там кредиты и так далее, настолько загоняют каждого в задницу человека. И об этом на самом деле никто так-то не говорит. Какое количество сейчас, допустим, даже в те же сложные времена такие, когда вот сейчас идет там специальная военная операция, да, где люди вообще умирают, в принципе, за какую-то сумму денег. То есть какая мотивация, то есть у мужика идти типа на войну, воевать и заработать денег? Потому что он вот в обычной жизни не понимает, типа, как реализовать себя. Он понимает, что он может пойти работать на какую-то работу, где зарплаты его все равно не будет хватать. Как бы тут тоже двойственная сторона. Хорошо, когда она есть, плохо, когда ее нету. Да, вот это маленькая даже зарплаты. Но морально-то ты все равно подавлен. Ты понимаешь, да, я там пойду туда, но как бы смысла мне этого не принесет большого. Да, у меня там станет, если я вообще не работаю и буду работать за 50 тысяч, хорошо, что они у меня есть, я смогу там покушать себе купить, но это же дизмораль. Когда ты заходишь в интернет и видишь, как люди там в Дубае летают, покупают себе огромное количество автомобилей какие-то, много всего такого, что ты за эту зарплату себе никогда в жизни позволить не сможешь. И как человеку оставаться морально типа сильным? что ему нужно делать? Ну, наверное, во-первых, это, наверное, все от семьи исходит, да? То есть, какая семья у тебя, как она построена. Если ты один живешь, это сложно, да, ты будешь сам себя, но у тебя, опять-таки, возможно, ну, родители, если есть, которые друзья поддержат тебя в какой-то момент, хотя бы просто отвлекут тебя от этих мыслей. А если у тебя, к примеру, там, семья, жена, к примеру, да, есть дети, то тут, наверное, поддержка только от них исходит какая-то. Вот. Чтобы не упиваться в своих мыслях о том, что какая нынче сложная жизнь. И, наверное, других-то вариантов, в принципе-то, и нету. Какие вот еще варианты, в принципе, изменить, поменять свою жизнь настолько, чтобы она была, ну, казалась тебе удачной, да, реализованным себя в жизни, в чем-то. В чем, вот как проявляется на самом деле у нас реализованность? Наверное, у 90% случаев это финансовое благополучие, финансовая независимость. Это, наверное, одно из таких ключевых моментов, когда человек, наверное, считает себя реализованным, да, в этой жизни. То есть, как добиться этого? То есть, с учетом того, что даже возьмем нашу страну, да, сколько миллионов людей здесь живет, как каждому добиться этого результата? Непонятно. И с каждым годом просто ситуация становится все хуже и хуже. Все дорожает, люди зарабатывают либо столько же. Ну, даже если они зарабатывают столько же, на самом деле этого все уже недостаточно. А к чему это все приведет на самом деле? В оконцове, наверное, мир погрязнет в большую депрессию в какую-то. Какие-то войны, возможно, или еще что-то еще больше глобальных таких вещей, которые не приведут ни к чему хорошему на самом деле. Поддержка каждого человека именно для того, чтобы он держался, наверное, морально, заключается в том, что, ну, наверное, дом, в который ты приходишь, должен быть крепостью твоей. Да, что это единственное должно быть место, где ты будешь чувствовать себя под защитой. Для этого было придумано, наверное, своя пещера изначально, потом свои какие-то чумы, палатки различные, да, потом все это превратилось. На данный момент это у нас дома, квартиры, в которые мы приходим и должны ощущать себя в безопасности. Чтобы можно быть немного морально расслабленным с учетом того, что ты выходишь каждый день на работу, на улицу, и все равно давление вот это вот, оно все равно присутствует. Когда ты заходишь в магазин, видишь цены эти, да, и так далее, не можешь себе что-то там приобрести, позволить на ежедневной основе, это откладывает большой, наверное, отпечаток. Не, наверное, а точно. И поэтому, когда возвращаясь домой, ты чувствуешь, вот хотя бы есть типа уголок того места, куда ты можешь прийти. Уголок на самом деле человеку много тоже не надо. Можно хотеть большего, но на самом деле человеку одному много не надо. Да? Ему нужно спальное место, спокойное место, где можно подумать. Ну, это когда ты один, к примеру, да? Когда у тебя есть семья, к примеру, ты приходишь домой, опять-таки, тут хотя бы, да, поговорить о каких-то вещах. Просто об отрешенных вещах, наверное. И, возможно, при этих же условиях у тебя и появляется какая-то дополнительная мотивация дополнительная мотивация для реализации себя. А когда у тебя нету ничего, вот это уже становится проблемой. И это у многих на самом деле. Что значит не иметь ничего? Тут, наверное, самое главное, дизмораль у человека еще возникает при том, что это уже, наверное, где-то в глубине души даже она возникает при даже хорошей финансовой подушке такой, которая у тебя есть, хороших финансовых деньгах, да, то есть, но нету вот внутреннего ощущения, к примеру, дружбы, семьи, любви и так далее. Это уже отдельно на самом деле разговор, потому что мы, вот, к примеру, можем взять, как сейчас вот Новстрой, если кто-то смотрит, насколько тяжело обладать такими финансами и не иметь, по сути, ничего. Ни друзей, ничего не иметь. Так главное, это получается для бедных главное деньги, для богатых главное какое-то внутреннее ощущение нужности, не из-за денег. Вот такое вот. И это борьба какая-то такая и вот эти два слоя общества, богатые и бедные, они друг друга не понимают. На самом деле из-за этого, возможно. Потому что богатый человек, он уже не смотрит на деньги, он не считает эти деньги. Ему важно внутреннее вот это вот ощущение того, что он нужен без них даже. Это как Тони Старку сказали: а кто ты без костюма? Она вот это: я филантроп, тудым-сюдым, он сказал, да? Так и человеку, у которого много денег, ты задашь вопрос: а кто ты без денег? Ну, что ты представляешь себе без денег? Вот и это, наверное, возможно, таких людей богатых, как вот, например, там Новстрой, задав ему этот вопрос: а кто ты без денег? Он на него ответить-то и не сможет. Обратная сторона людей бедных, да, вот если мы посмотрим, человеку